What happens if you have one of these Q dots and then the surviving spouse decides to move back overseas?
Well, it's very common that that happens. First off, the trust stays here. That's why we have a U.S. citizen or a U.S. corporation trustee. Now, the assets can be invested somewhere else, but the taxing authority and the legal authority still stay in the United States. The real difficulty is if you're not a citizen and you go overseas, does that impact how this is taxed to you when you die? And because you may not get a $5 million estate tax exemption anymore. And ultimately, this trust is still in your estate, and it's U.S. assets. So it can be a lot more restrictive, especially in your freedom of movement, if you're trying to avoid taxation.
Okay. So now we're going to get into a good issue, and that is, what is domicile? What's the impact of domicile on an estate plan for a non-citizen?
So every non-citizen has to have a domicile somewhere in the world, right? So a domicile essentially is, where do you intend to die? When we're talking about estate tax purposes, that's really what we're thinking of, is where do you intend to die? Now, if you have a green card, for example, your income tax domicile may be the United States. In fact, it is, because we tax you on your worldwide income, right? But if you may be from the Philippines and come to America to work, but when you stop work, you intend to go back to the Philippines. That may mean that your domicile is still in the Philippines and not in the United States. And of course, this has huge ramifications for how your estate is taxed from an estate tax standpoint. And what I find is even less people understand these rules and get caught with a really big tax problem when they die because they didn't plan for where they were domiciled. And the tax court and the IRS are going to argue whatever brings in the most revenue. So they're going to look for where can we get the most money, and then that's what they're going to try and argue. And you're dead, so you don't get to testify. Right.
Now, sometimes I've seen this, that people say in their documents. So, you know, I, Charles Schultz, okay, Charlie, sorry. But anyway, you know, a resident of Santa Rosa in California, for example. So when you have that kind of language in the document, then that, I would think, would have a pretty strong influence on what a court might say as far as where your domicile is.
Well, you might think that it would, but the reality is it may not. So what the court is going to use is what we call a facts and circumstances test. And they're going to take a whole lot of information to determine the reality of the situation. Oftentimes that kind of language is what's called boilerplate. Nobody pays any attention to it. It's just part of the forms that the attorney or the software program was using. And therefore the court may not actually give it much weight at all, because it's not something that you really thought through when you said that. What we have our clients do is actually sign an affidavit under penalty of perjury saying, this is the domicile that I have, and here's the reasons why it's my domicile. Because that is evidence that is admissible in court. It's something you've actually thought through, and you've made a conscious decision to say, this is how I want to be taxed, essentially.
Okay. Maybe you can, what's the difference a little bit between how a person who's not a resident of the United States is taxed compared to somebody who is?
Right, because this is really the crux of the problem, and where people just really get surprised. If you're a U.S. citizen, you have a $5 million estate tax exemption. And then you don't pay any tax until after that. If you're domiciled in the U.S., even though you're not a U.S. citizen, you also get a $5 million estate tax exemption. Now, for both citizens and people who are not citizens but domiciled in the U.S., to get that $5 million exemption, the U.S. also taxes you on your worldwide estate. Yeah. So everything you own around the world is included in your estate for U.S. tax purposes. Mm-hmm. When you're not a citizen and not domiciled in the United States, you only get a $60,000 estate tax exemption.
Wow, very small.
It's very, very small. Now, you're only taxed on your U.S. assets. Mm-hmm. So if you're not domiciled here and have lots of property in India, you're not taxed on the property in India. Mm-hmm. So that may be what you want to be, right? Yeah. You don't want to be domiciled here. Uh-huh. On the other hand, if you don't have much in India, right, and you have property here, then you want to be domiciled here so you can get the higher exemption. But the worst case scenario is when you haven't thought this through, and we see clients who end up domiciled here, but they have millions of dollars of property somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And then now they have a big problem because they have a big tax bill that they weren't expecting because they're domiciled here and all their foreign assets are coming into the U.S. for tax purposes, or they're not paying attention, they're not domiciled here because they're not here enough, or they still have ties to their former country, but they own real estate in California. Mm-hmm. And with the price of California real estate, I don't think you can buy anything that's $60,000.
No.
so there goes your tax bill, and you weren't even prepared for that.
Yeah. What are some examples of U.S. assets compared to foreign assets?
Well, certainly dirt. Right, that's easy to determine, right? So if it's in California, it's in the United States, it's subject to tax, right? But U.S. corporate stock, for example. So if you have stock in Coca-Cola, that's a U.S. corporation, so that's a U.S. asset. It doesn't matter if you buy that on an exchange in Singapore or London or Tokyo or somewhere else around the world. Mm-hmm. It's still a U.S. corporation. Mm-hmm. Now, if you have a foreign corporation, let's say Toyota, right, or Samsung, so you can buy that in the United States. It's still a foreign corporation. So it's where the corporation's located that matters, not where the exchange is that you bought it on. Same with bonds, right? What country's bonds or what corporation? Where is that corporation located for bonds?
Okay. So are we looking like basically, because Coca-Cola, you've took out a couple of great examples, Coca-Cola and Toyota, okay, these companies are doing business all over the globe. Are we basically looking for where the corporate headquarters are?
Yeah, they have to be registered as a corporation. So for example, a number of corporations have started reincorporating out of Delaware and in other countries like Ireland or something like that for tax purposes. But then all of a sudden, you have a foreign you may have a foreign corporation instead of a U.S. corporation. Mm-hmm. By and large, unless you have a lot of stock there, you're either going to say, I'm not investing in America, or I am. Mm-hmm. And you just want to make sure you know what to do for those purposes. But if you died, then you actually have to look, what type of corporation is this?
Okay, and as I understand it, you can actually do some tax planning with entities and things. So if you've got U.S. stock, maybe you can set up a foreign corporation to hold the stock.
So you set up an LLC or something in the Cayman Islands and have that own your foreign stock, or your corporation own that U.S. stock, right? Mm-hmm. We do the same thing with property. Mm-hmm. I mean, you own real estate in California, you put it into a U.S. corporation, have the U.S. corporation owned by a foreign corporation, and now it's not owned by you directly, and therefore it's not a U.S. asset. Of course, there's always severe tax consequences if you're putting a real estate into a corporation.
Right.
So do not do that at home, right?
Yeah.
Make sure you get a professional advisor to work with you on that, because you may be exchanging one benefit for another really bad consequence.
Right. Yeah, we usually don't like to put real estate in corporations.
Absolutely not. But if you had to pay a 55% tax when you died,
Yeah.
you might decide that would be okay.
Yeah. Maybe you could share. Probably got about maybe 4.5 minutes left. What are some maybe? Excuse me. I guess about 3 minutes. So maybe you can tell a little story about one or two clients that had one of these situations that you had to help them out with.
Absolutely. I had a client where he had about $15 million of property in Saratoga. And he traveled to Italy, met this wonderful woman. His wife had passed away previously. They got married, and they spent half of the year in Italy and half of the year in Saratoga.
Oh boy.
And with his business, he was leaving everything to his two sons to run and stuff. He had a life insurance policy to take care of his wife. She had about $5 million in net worth in Italy.
Wow.
And she had a son and a grandson in Italy. Mm-hmm. So the only reason she's in America is to be with him.
Yes.
If he dies, she's going to go back to Italy. Now, at this time, the estate tax exemption was only $1.5 million.
Okay.
So, there wasn't a lot of wiggle room. And they went to another attorney. Something, is usually not a good solution. Okay, but the attorney said you need to do this QDOT. But you know what? The QDOT is so difficult and so difficult to have that really you should become a U.S. citizen so you don't need the QDOT. Mm-hmm. And when she became a U.S. citizen, she then brought that $5 million of property from Italy into the U.S. tax system. Uh-huh. And the sad part about this was he wasn't leaving her any of his assets. He had set up a life insurance policy that was in a trust outside of his estate for tax purposes. So there was never going to be a QDOT needed in the first place, mm-hmm. because she wasn't getting anything from him. Uh-huh. And so, these types of things, you have to make sure your attorney understands the issues, but you also want to make sure that you understand what the tax consequences are for being a citizen or being domiciled here versus just being a non-resident alien. Okay. Because that can make a huge difference in your tax planning.
Right. So I hope our viewers are getting an appreciation that this is actually a very complex area. And so again, what we're trying to do is sort of bring it to your consciousness. Maybe, it may not even be you, it may be a friend or a relation that may have this issue, and so at least you can alert them. And by the way, this will be posted at my website, financialinsiderweekly.com, under past episodes. So this information will be available for people to watch as a video, and then maybe they can get additional information. Ray, I want to thank you so much for being my guest and for sharing this important information. Folks, I hope that you found this thought-provoking, and if you do have it apply to you, then I hope you will see that attorney and the other tax advisor and start taking care of it. And we'll see you next time on Financial Insider Weekly.